Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to today's luncheon at the Ruby Forum in Washington, D.C. I'm Tariq Shafi. Our guest speaker today is Ambassador Robert E. Hunter, and he's the Senior Advisor at the RAND Corporation and former U.S. Ambassador to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, commonly known as NATO, from 1993 to 1998. The title of his talk is very simple and appropriate. It is NATO After the Summit. I have to admit that Ambassador Hunter's resume is quite brilliant, and I'd be hard-pressed to give it full justice today, but I'll give it a try anyway. So here goes.
Short introductions are best, please.
Other than being a senior advisor at the RAND Corporation, he is also chairman of the Council for a Community of Democracies, senior international consultant to Lockheed Martin, and associate at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, senior concept developer for NATO's Allied Command Transformation, and member of the U.S.-European Command's Senior Advisory Group. He has been president of the Atlantic Treaty Association and also was a principal architect of the new NATO Partnership for Peace and NATO-EU relations, negotiated the airstrike decisions that ended the Bosnia War, and then negotiated the post-war peace force. He has received the Pentagon's highest civilian award, the DoD Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and has worked also with the Carter administration and was co-author of the Carter Doctrine for the Persian Gulf. He was also a foreign policy advisor to Senator Ted Kennedy, senior fellow at the Overseas Development Council, and has also worked with the Johnson administration in health, education, welfare, and labor, and in the U.S. Navy's Polaris project, Washington and London. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. I know the title of your talk is, very simply, NATO After the Summit. But for us, please go back 60 years and tell us why and by whom NATO was founded. Perhaps it was a militaristic response to an aggressive and expanding Soviet Union. Perhaps the reasons were more benign. Commerce and trade and other strategic ideas were behind the formation. Tell us who the parties were and the member nations that formed it, and then evolve towards the additional turmoil within it, which other member nations joined it, and then bring us up to speed to the present time, and then of course go forward with your talk, which is after the summit that happened just recently. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate that very generous introduction. After that, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. It's also a great honor to be with you.
Thank you.
And with the Rumi Forum. I've actually had the honor of having been to the tomb of Rumi in Konya, which, if you haven't been there, I very strongly recommend it.
Sure.
It's an extraordinary place. And he was an extraordinary person who speaks to us today just as much as he spoke to the people of his own time. There have been a handful of truly great people like that in human civilization, and he's one of them.
Cool.
I've been to Turkey several times, and most of the folks here, I guess, are associated with Turkey. I was saying to our good friend here, who is from Istanbul, why would he want to live here if he could live there? And to give you an example, I was at a conference there a few years ago, and they had a dinner, which was at the Four Seasons Hotel, which used to be a prison, I think it was. So that this wide area at the top for walking around. And the dinner was right there. It was in a very balmy late spring evening with a perfectly clear sky. The crescent moon was coming up, and over one shoulder was the Blue Mosque illuminated. Over the other was the Hagia Sophia illuminated. And I said, God couldn't make it any better than this,
Correct.
I don't think. And it was extraordinary. So next time we'll have to do this in Turkey, whether Istanbul, Ankara, or Konya, or someplace else.
It's a deal.
It's a deal. Thank you very much. Or in Pakistan, if I may say so, sir.
If it survives.
Well, one of the things we're talking about today is what do we need to do to help Pakistan survive?
Right.
And whether NATO has a role in that, and that's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, NATO celebrated 60 years, remarkably so, in General Dwight Eisenhower became the first Supreme Allied Commander, he said, if we're still around doing this thing 40 years from now, we will have failed. But it was the other way around. The fact it's still around 60 years is a sign of success. NATO was created beginning in 1949 with the signature of the treaty here in Washington by President Harry Truman, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, with 11 other countries. Not Turkey and Greece at that point. It was core countries in Europe plus Canada because of the emerging Cold War and the threat posed by the Soviet Union and by communism. It was recognized that the reconstruction of Europe and the Marshall Plan was very important. Efforts to prevent inroads by communism in Western Europe were important. But that for people to get on with the work, they were going to need some kind of strategic confidence, which was a U.S. commitment to the security of these countries, and hence NATO. And NATO provided a bulwark against the Soviet Union and its ambitions, and against the advance of communism, all the way up until that extraordinary day in 1989, November the 9th, when the Berlin Wall finally opened, and led to the collapse not only of the Soviets' East European Empire, but of the internal empire as well. The 15 countries that emerged out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union. In fact, historically, it was the most profound strategic retreat of any country or empire in peacetime history. Nothing in all of history to compare to that. And ultimately, the pen was mightier than the sword, as Mr. Jefferson said. But NATO throughout that period had been the bulwark. Well, after the end of the Cold War, people say, why NATO? Mm-hmm. And incidentally, I should mention that during that period, other countries were added. In 1952, Turkey and Greece joined. Later on, Spain joined to bring it up to a total of 16 countries. And Germany, of course, in the mid-1950s, West Germany. But after the end of the Cold War, people said, what about NATO? And it turned out that, as one might say, if, like Voltaire said about God, if it hadn't existed, it would have been necessary to admit it, necessary to invent it, rather, because of a bunch of unfinished business. So in the 1990s, under U.S. leadership, on a bipartisan basis, under President George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, and then the most recent George W. Bush, following a vision that was put together by George Bush the Elder. Very few words, but very profound. To try to create a Europe whole and free. Few words. Extremely profound objective, which meant to try with all the countries that had been part of NATO, other European countries not part of NATO, all the Central European countries, plus all the countries out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union, having a chance to try to build something together, which for the first time in European history, at least since Charlemagne, I guess, where everybody had a chance to benefit and nobody potentially would lose from it if they were prepared to recognize their own self-interest, and most have done. So in the 1990s, what did NATO do? It kept the United States engaged as a European power, right? It continued to give a home for Germany, both NATO and the European Union. It took Central Europe off the strategic chessboard, locked them down as members of NATO with the U.S. commitment, the commitment of all 16 then allies, now 28, as of the NATO summit, soon to be 29, with the forthcoming admission of Macedonia once the Greeks and the Macedonians can figure out what the Macedonians are allowed to call their country. Take them off the chessboard so they won't be the proximate cause of war anymore. To reach out to Russia, unlike what was done to Germany in 1919, reach out and try to draw Russia in. And then to try to stop conflict in Europe itself. And number one was in Bosnia. And it took an 18-day NATO bombing campaign to cause Mr. Milosevic in Serbia to stop the aggression against the people of Bosnia. It led to the Dayton Accords and to the independence and security of Bosnia. And since that time, in 1995, nobody's died in conflict in Bosnia. Well, Milosevic tried it again in 98, 99 in Kosovo. NATO had to do it again. It took 78 days that time. But this time, it led to eventually to the fall of Milosevic and the progressive engagement of NATO in this part of Europe. the southern part of Europe and in the Balkans. Subsequently, NATO having crossed a threshold that for the common security of the members and the promotion of fundamental democratic values, a bedrock of NATO and of Western civilization. And also, in conjunction with the European Union, which was also engaging these countries and helping them to modernize and democratize and be secure, that NATO would continue to be engaged and would do so what they call outside of area, beyond the area defined in the NATO treaty. Here's where you have to defend one another, but beyond that, well, it's discretionary. Bosnia and Kosovo. And then later some other actions. Support for what the European Union has tried to do in East Africa. Aircraft support for some efforts in the Congo. Earthquake relief in Pakistan, done by the NATO response force. The NATO countries were not prepared to become engaged in Iraq, highly contentious act by the United States and a few European countries in 2002. But following the attack on this country on 9/11/2001, not only did all the NATO countries and people around the world express compassion and commitment with the United States for what we'd gone through, but they also invoked the central clause of the NATO treaty for the first time ever. The one for all and all for one clause, and threw in their lot with the United States. And later on, beginning in 2003, NATO became involved in Afghanistan, so that today, ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, which is trying to do things effectively in Afghanistan, is now run by NATO. All 28 NATO allies, are there, plus another 14 other countries, based in Kabul with ISAF. Highly contentious, however, within the alliance. And yet, I think there's no doubt that NATO's success in Afghanistan is important, not just for my country, but success is important for others. And there are at least a couple of things that are involved, many, many things. One is a counter to terrorism that was developed in that country and brought home to my country through Al-Qaeda. To follow up on kind of the moral commitment that we've achieved, that we've undertaken to try to keep the Taliban from taking power again in Afghanistan, a very tiny sect of Islam. And a third function going on is to carry on the work of true understanding in the West of what Islam really is and what it isn't. The Islamist terrorists, if that's the correct term, 0.5%, 1/4 the people in the Muslim world.
Tiny minority.
Tiny minority. And the biggest victims have been Muslims. Well, in the West, and NATO's already stood up for Muslims in Bosnia, Muslims in Kosovo, Muslims in Afghanistan, Muslims in Pakistan with earthquake relief, etc. It's almost as though the vocation of NATO, to a great extent, has been to help people in the Islamic world in their quest to become, where it already hasn't already happened, modern states. And particularly, if I may say so, as many as possible to emulate what Turkey has done. Now, I haven't mentioned Turkey up till now. As you know, the question of Turkey's full engagement in Europe and in the European Union is still highly problematic. The United States has a very clear commitment on it. When I was a NATO ambassador, I had a very clear commitment on behalf of my country. We think the Europeans should take Turkey into the European Union, and President Obama did so as well. He took the lead on that. Now,
what's the sticking point for the Europeans? The primary sticking point that Turkey should be full member NATO partner.
Well, as I've already illustrated, it can't just be because people are Muslim, because things have already been done for people of the Muslim religion. Not only people living in individual countries, though a number of European countries are having deep difficulty in coming to terms with the rise of Muslim populations in their own society. And that, in fact, is the biggest challenge that European societies have right now. And it's not a matter of having members, because Albania, which is a member of NATO, is a Muslim country, et cetera. There are Muslims in Bulgaria, et cetera, which is a European Union member. I think some things is, one, Turkey's a very big country. If memory serves, if it came into the European Union, it would be the second largest country after Germany. And I think in addition, yes, there is a good deal of racism. Let's face it, a good deal of racism. There's a good deal still of cultural insensitivity. There's also a question, I think, of the extent to which Turkey in all of its parts has modernized to the point where it would be a contributor to what's being done in the European Union, as opposed to drawing heavily on resources from other countries, as was true with Spain and Portugal when they came in, still true with, was true with Greece, and is still true with most of the Central European countries. My own judgment is that Turkey's aspirations need to be honored. Its aspirations, and it's the facts of its being part of Western civilization more than any other quality. And that this has got to be worked out. The United States can do what it can, but we don't have a seat at the table. So we do what we can.
Especially, I would say, Germany and to some extent France have a large Turkish immigrant population. And they're just concerned about, I guess, the turmoil it could cause if NATO were to admit Turkey fully because of its the indigenous immigrant population.
Yes, I think there is a concern there, but I think it's probably, I do think it is misplaced. And I think these countries have to recognize already that the people from Turkey and elsewhere, but from Turkey, let's say in particular, in their own societies, there are parts of Germany where you could have been a third generation German.
And you're still Turkish.
And you're still Turkish. Now, it works both ways. There are some responsibilities on the part of people coming from the Islamic world to adjust to some of the ways in which people, the individual cultures. It's a two-way street. But the primary responsibility does come from the receiving countries. And also, quite frankly, the more that is done to help Turkey modernize, as it's doing at an extraordinary pace, the less these problems will be, whether membership or no membership in the European Union. And the more interaction there is of individual peoples. It's going to take them a long while to do it. We've been fortunate. We've had a lot of problems in our country over our history, but in general, we've been a welcoming country. And in fact, this is non-NATO, et cetera. We're not on the topic yet, but after 9/11, there are a couple of striking things in a positive sense. One, while there has been some abuse of Muslims in this country, it has not been widespread through American society.
Yeah, I would agree with that, yes.
One of the things is an awful lot of Americans know an awful lot of Muslims. That's my dentist, it's my doctor. It's my CPA, and where were you when I was doing my taxes, okay? So people say, hey, come on, give me a break. Remembering back what we did to the Japanese Americans, not Japanese, in 1942, put them in concentration camps. Right. The second good thing, and where the Rumi Forum, I think, is playing a very important role, and I hope you have a chance to play even more of a role. If there was one good thing that came out of 9/11, it was that the accurate knowledge by Americans, non-Muslim Americans, of what Islam really is has progressed more rapidly than perhaps the whole rest of our history. That's been a good thing. Been a good thing.
And yet we still hear people talk of Islamo-terrorism, Islamo-fascism. They always have this hyphenated version of whatever ticks them off and put Islamic version in front of it.
I think these people would have found somebody else to go after if it hadn't been that. That's their problem. It can affect the way people feel about how they're treated, and that's correct. It can affect the way behavior in some communities, and that's correct, the protest. But I think one also has to look back to the extraordinary events in this country. One of the most fantastic days in all of American history was November the 4th, 2008, when we elected an African-American president. And not because, we didn't elect him because he was an African-American, we elected him because he's a hell of a guy. Smart, intelligent, a leader for our nation at this particular time. And I'm delighted that he has a middle name, Hussein. I'm delighted that he spent a fair part of his youth in other cultures and has a sensitivity and a capacity to help. And what it's done for our standing in the world has been breathtaking. And what it's done for race relations in this country has been breathtaking. Not just by what he symbolized, but what he does, but the culmination of a lot of other things have been done in this country. You mentioned I worked in the Johnson administration. I was in Lyndon Johnson's White House in 1965 at the time of Selma. And to think you could go from that 43 years to electing an African-American president.
It's quite amazing. Yeah.
It's an amazing thing.
Only in America.
Well, only in America, yes, only in America. And I hope you don't mind my saying, in a nonpartisan audience, we have a great president, and a truly great president, and a great leader for America and the world. Now, we still haven't gotten on the topic, but I think it's useful to talk about these important
Coming
things.
back to NATO then,
Yeah.
it has had its share of problems, internal conflicts of interest among member nations, France pulling out of the military wing of it and then being readmitted. What's caused that? And does Europe, is it flexing its muscle as a whole, especially France and Germany, and trying to ease the US influence out of the NATO? So because of the European Union that is competing with the US, China, Russia?
You know, it's certain relationships we have with friendly countries abroad and within an alliance like NATO have become so familiar. We forget that these are sovereign countries. They each have their own interests, their own histories, their own cultures, different languages, different ways of looking at the world. But the fact is that since the end of the Second World War, where enough people said never again after the worst war in human history, along with the First World War, and there have been, despite the differences, so many unifying qualities, partly provided by the Soviet Union and the threat of communism, but partly by the depth of the human values and the democratic values that we share together. Now, once you've said that, you can go on and say, okay, countries have different views. The Spanish and the British went at one another for years over the future of Gibraltar. Even today, Greece and Turkey work very effectively together in NATO, but sometimes outside they don't work as effectively together. One of the problems today still is about Cyprus. My personal view is that Cyprus should not have been allowed into the European Union until that issue had been resolved, but it needs to be resolved. And in that regard, something the European Union can ultimately do, but it's got to work a lot harder than it did, which is the value of economic progress and democratization does help societies to get over historic difficulties. The best testament to that, perhaps, is what's been happening in Ireland. Prosperity in the southern part of Ireland had as much to do with anything to make the Irish question now relatively minor after all those years. And they're both in the European Union. So there have always been difficulties. But the core features have always been there. For example, you mentioned that France in 1966 withdrew from the integrated military command structure, largely because it saw a need, General de Gaulle saw a need, to work with the Germans, who had an aspiration to find a way to go beyond division. Well, we got all upset in the United States. But France never left NATO.
No.
Never left the political side of it, never.
Correct.
And its reintegration now into the command structure is useful for France, useful for everybody else in terms of the challenges we face in the future. Actually, we've had no better ally than France over the years in terms of practical things. I worked very hard when I was at NATO to try to bring France back into the command structure. At the same time, to get the United States to recognize that the development of a European personality in security, big term, European Security and Defense Policy, ESDP, great acronym, with the European Union was no threat to the United States or to NATO, and so it has proved. And if that aspiration to build a United States of Europe, if you want to call out, with a defense and foreign policy personality is something Europeans want to do, and if that leads them to spend more on security, that's a good thing.
But
And so
Hunter,
that's not a problem.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about the Warsaw Pact. Why was that formed? And what did the Western powers promise the Russians or the Soviets? There seems to be an incursion far out into Eastern Europe to have these former Soviet satellite states be brought into the NATO sphere, and so the Warsaw Pact is now irrelevant. Is that right?
Well, the Warsaw Pact was created in 1955 after Germany was brought into NATO. It was essentially irrelevant because the Soviet Union already had its bilateral relations with each of these countries. It had its troops in all these countries. And so they just created this organization to make it look like NATO. But it was just a tool of Soviet imperialism.
I see.
If that's the right word. I think it is the right word. And of course it collapsed in 1991 because the Soviet Union went away and the Soviets withdrew their troops and each of these countries became free and democratic countries. Now, NATO has taken countries into its membership from Central Europe and a few others. To begin with, through a thing called the Partnership for Peace, which I helped to create, which was to work with the militaries in all the countries that came out of the wreckage of the Soviet empires, internal and external, to democratize their military, to help them learn the processes of modernization, and it worked. And taking these countries in Central Europe and putting them into NATO, as I've said, takes them off the chessboard of competition.
Right.
They're no longer in play. The fact they were in play in 1914 and 1939 and 1947 helped to create the three great wars of the 20th century. In fact, after the unity of Germany, the Soviet Union and then Russia had a choice to make. Would they accept that the eastern part of Germany would be unified with the western part in NATO, or just rattling around loose? And they accepted that be part of NATO, so that the United States would watch over the future of Germany. Now, the Russians have had a problem with some of the bases that have been put by NATO in these countries. They've had a problem, which is more psychological than anything else, with the idea of building missile defenses against Middle East countries like maybe Iran someday in Poland and the Czech Republic. The Russians had a problem with Kosovo becoming an independent recognized state. They argue there's a parallel with South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia. Well, the Russians are not 100% wrong in that. And I think the United States overreached a bit on that. But that's minor stuff compared to the larger stuff, which is to try to reach out to Russia and draw it into the outside world. And Russia needs that. For example, last year when there was this small conflict between Russia and Georgia, Russia was the big loser. Because unlike 1923 under Lenin and 1948 under Stalin, Russia has to be in the outside world. It's basically why the Soviet Union collapsed. It needs the outside world. And right now, who's going to trust Russia? Well, one of the things that President Obama did when he was in Europe, because the Allies are worried, is there going to be a new Cold War? Is Russia going to be able to encroach? Is it going to misbehave in regard to Ukraine? Is the United States going to get it wrong in regard to dealing with Russia? But President Obama met with President Medvedev of Russia, and they agreed on an agenda for dealing with arms control, a replacement for the START Treaty, for example. And more than anything else, that told people the United States is willing to take charge of dealing with Russia, so that unless Russia is really stupid, it is not going to be a negative element on European security.
You mentioned Russia was the bigger loser.
Yes.
But they contend, they say, look, Georgia started it all. I believe it was South Ossetia that the problem started in, and they say, what would other countries have done? We control this. I mean, do you expect us to just stay and just take it on the chin?
Well, I think it's clear that Mr. Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, did not behave in a way that was in the best Georgian interest. Whether the Russians were just lying in wait for him to do something like this or not, we can debate it. In any event, the Russians really overreacted, over-responded, went much farther than they had any right by any standard to do. They continue to have troops in Georgia despite the agreements reached at the Geneva conference some time ago. They give passports to people living in Abkhazia, Russian passports. The Russians clearly are misbehaving, however this came about.
Yes.
And as I say, they need the outside world. And with the collapse of the price of oil, $145 during the Georgia crisis, now to about 47, and with the international financial crisis in which the Russians lost a huge amount of money, let's hope they've learned their lesson.
Mm-hmm. May I bring you forward now to the present problem of piracy off the Somali coast? These people not to romanticize what used to happen hundreds and thousands of years ago with swashbuckling buccaneers and real pirates. These are thugs, sea muggers. Does NATO have a role in controlling these people, and what should it be? They have to be effective and efficient to deal with these ragtag army people or people who just do the mugging on the high seas. What role does NATO have?
I think this is a very important question because it is obvious that one thing that has to happen is to demonstrate that there is no future for the pirates in terms of their own security, that countries affected by it, and a huge amount of the world's trade goes to that particular area, off East Africa and then up to Aden and past Eritrea, etc. What the United States did in rescuing the captain of the particular vessel, what the French do, which you don't see a lot of, is, I think, part of the pattern of the future. And here NATO has a tremendous opportunity because there is a standing NATO naval forces that can be involved. It is something that all NATO allies are affected by. There is no doubt, as there was over Iraq, about whether individual countries are affected. There is no doubt, as you find in some European countries, about what happens in Afghanistan affects their countries. Most European allies don't really believe, whether they're right or wrong, we believe they're wrong, what happens in Afghanistan is going to come home to affect their countries. But nobody has any doubt that piracy affects their countries. Nobody. And it's a two-element process. One is the military element, but the other is something has to be done about the conditions that help to breed this kind of lawlessness in the countries that are most engaged, particularly Somalia, which is a state which doesn't really have a functioning government, a state that is in dire poverty, etc. And one of the aspects that we have now of globalization, where you can have something like piracy 8,000 miles from here affecting us and in Europe, where you can have something like swine flu, which is now borne by vectors which somebody gets on an airplane and flies halfway around the world. We're going to have to recognize certain added responsibilities for doing things with these countries to try to get rid of the causes, just as we have to work with other countries to get rid of, I won't say the causes of some of this terrorism, because a lot of these people are just criminals. But the kinds of things when the terrorist recruiting sergeants come around and they look at somebody who's poor, doesn't have a job, hadn't been educated, who has a government that's really rotten, to start taking away from the recruiting sergeants the siren song of promoting terrorism. It's one thing that I believe that I wish more of it had happened at the summit. I believe the United States and the European Union need to forge a much more profound strategic partnership. And I don't mean military now. I mean in terms of health, education, job creation, good governance, where together we and the European countries, we the United States, Canadians, and the Europeans, have the overwhelming bulk of capacity. Functioning economies, democracies, well-motivated private sector in health and education, other things, the things that we can do together to help these countries move beyond this. And I think it's an absolute responsibility that we have to do. And that, unfortunately, I think, I wish the President had done more of that when he was in Prague for the summit with the European Union, but let's hope that'll be next year's agenda.
Mr. Ambassador, does NATO work independently of the UN or in conjunction with it? Does it need the UN's green light act when its interests are threatened?
The answer to all those questions is yes and no. NATO does exist within the framework of the UN Charter. And whenever NATO takes a decision about the use of force, it always refers to the UN Charter, including Article 51. And it always talks about NATO's military actions until such time as peace and security are restored according to the UN Charter. And most of what it's done, just about everything it's done except one thing, which was in Kosovo, it's done with a UN Security Council resolution. Very important that at least one institution at least operate according to the rule of law. Terrorists, pirates, and others, communist countries couldn't care less about the rule of law.
No.
But we have to. That's partly of our fundament of where we stand. Now, the Europeans probably care even more about it than the United States in terms of its justification, because they went through the Nazis and the communists. So they're much more sensitive even than we are. Bosnia, UN resolution. Afghanistan, UN resolution. Relief for people in Pakistan against the earthquake, UN resolution. On Kosovo, the Russians and the Chinese were not prepared to bless a UN resolution for reasons of their own, so the NATO countries decided to do it without UN support. Now, NATO stands ready if the UN comes calling and saying, will you help us such and such a place? So far, NATO's never said no.
I see. Does the Secretary-General of NATO, is he or she appointed by member nations? How does that work, and for what period of time is the Secretary-General appointed? Is it always a European?
Well, Secretary-General of NATO who's also chairman of the North Atlantic Council. North Atlantic Council is the 28 countries making decisions for NATO. Day-to-day ambassadors, sometimes foreign ministers, defense ministers, and then in Strasbourg and Kiel this April, it was heads of state and government as the North Atlantic Council. So the NATO Secretary-General is the convener, the organizer, runs the meetings. He's the number one diplomat. It has always traditionally been a European because the Supreme Allied Commander Operations, as it's now called, is always an American general or admiral. We actually have the first admiral who's just been appointed, James Stavridis, a Turk with a Greek name. All right?
Interesting.
Interesting, yes. We just have a brand new NATO Secretary-General from Prime Minister Rasmussen of Denmark. Now, he's chosen by consensus. Who is the best person to lead the Council for the next 4 years, with a year potentially extended? One thing you have to understand about NATO is all decisions are taken by consensus. There's never a vote. So if you're sitting 28 ambassadors or ministers around the table, one person is going to put up his or her hand and say, I object, and that's it. That means when NATO takes a decision, everybody sticks by it. Because the next time it might be my interests that I need. So it takes a long time sometimes to reach a decision, but then NATO is absolutely resolute. And Afghanistan is the big problem today. The big problem today for NATO, also for my country. We have Americans fighting and dying in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We have this critical question of Pakistan. These are the really big issues. NATO's involved very little in Iraq. There's a training mission. Somewhat in Iraq and Afghanistan, I've already mentioned, and so far not at all in Pakistan. And what happened at the summit, the president wanted to get some more troops from the NATO allies. We provide about 2/3 of them. And some of the allies were prepared to do that. Next to 5,000 troops, not enough. Some have limitations on where their troops can fight and how they can fight. Because back home, parliaments say, wait a second, Afghanistan, that's over in the backside of the moon.
Right.
Why are we doing that? We will do it for the Americans, we'll do it for NATO, but we don't do it because we're worried about terrorism. So the Europeans are going to be asked to do a lot more in governance, reconstruction, development. But right now, the biggest fault line in NATO is as follows. Most of the Europeans want us to focus on Europe, on Russia, on the Balkans, on the Baltics, on energy, on cybersecurity. Whereas the United States wants from its allies to be focused on Afghanistan, to an extent on Pakistan, to an extent on Iraq. So we're having a real struggle now to come to terms with, let's say, a new bargain between the United States and its European allies on what we should be doing.
Mr. Ambassador, we just have a few more minutes in this session. You were in the thick of things in the 90s, during the Bosnia War, the Kosovo. You were a true decision maker with the president. And
well, NATO ambassador operates under instructions that come from the Secretary of State acting for the president.
But your input was valuable.
Even though you have a little input.
Right, no, I'm sure.
A little input.
You're being modest now. My question is your personal feelings about that period now, going back and thinking about it now. Did you achieve enough? You mentioned earlier that NATO has been there for Muslim countries. Sometimes Americans feel, Europeans feel that Muslims are not grateful enough for what the Western powers have done through the UN or the NATO powers. Is that feeling, does it irk you? Is that there's some truth to it? And looking back, would you have done or suggested some things differently? It took, it seems, a long time to act before these rascals, these Milosevic, Radovich, they were captured. It just seemed that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, Bosnians, Muslims, and other minority groups died before NATO or the UN came to their help. Is it always the case that bureaucracies move so slowly?
Well, actually, about 200,000 Bosnians died in the period of 2 years in which those of us who were at NATO were trying to get NATO to operate. And when it did operate, when it finally took military action, it only took 18 days to stop the war. Right? Now, I'm quite pleased by what we did in the 90s. We had a strategic requirement in the post-Cold War era. Keep America engaged, home for Germany, lock down Central Europe, reach out to Russia, relationship with the European Union, revise the military, stop the war in Bosnia, and then when it happened, stop the war in Kosovo. It's one of the few times in which we have taken, as a nation, a genuine grand strategic set of decisions. Most of the time, we react to what's going on in the world. But the kind of combination of what George H.W. Bush did, Europe whole and free as a goal, and what he and Bill Clinton did to implement that, I think was an amazing achievement. You can say about Bosnia, it wasn't so much it took 2 years to do it, it was that NATO finally did act. And once having acted there, was then prepared to act against Kosovo and to do other things and to recognize that this organization that was created for one purpose, really, to stop Soviet aggression and defeat and contain communism, had turned around to do some entirely different things, which to meet the strategic, political, moral, cultural, economic requirements of the 21st century. Should more things have been done? Absolutely. I wish the first time we got a decision by NATO potentially to use force in 1993, it had happened then, the use of force, rather than 2 years later. Of course, the UN was blocking it, in part, because of the Russians and the Chinese at the UN Security Council. So I don't have any regrets about that, but recognizing now that NATO and the European Union have to work together. They have to break down the barriers between them. They have to see as a seamless web security. It starts with trying to help people get jobs, to have a good education, to have health care, to have better governance. And then if there's still conflict, to come in and work on the conflict and then and bring it to a halt, to deal with the bad guys, as you put it, and then to stay around and help people build their societies afterwards. And that's got to be all done together. And I think this is a very important thing. I've said some nice things about Turkey here, and I know Turkey's got some concerns, but I think one thing Turkey can contribute right now, because of its concern about Cyprus and about the European Union, it is blocking cooperation between NATO and the European Union. I don't think that's in Turkey's interest. I really don't.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, finally, would you agree that NATO is here to stay 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? Will we see a viable, stronger NATO than we have today?
I have no idea. It's an institution that has to deal with its immediate problems. As long as it deals with the problems, the requirements, the challenges, the security, the values, the cooperation with others of the moment, and building for the future, it'll be around. If not, it won't be. And right now, it's these two big things, getting the military and the non-military to work together on the things that are a corpus of providing security of the individual and security of the state. They're all mixed up together. And then to get NATO and the European Union together. And the third thing, I should have said 3, not 2, for the United States and the Europeans to come to a deal. We will do as much as is required to keep Europe stable and secure, but we need the engagement of the Europeans to help in places in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, where, in our judgment, they are just as much at risk as we are. And most of them don't see it that way.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your input, valuable insight into NATO and its workings. Thank you very much. That's the end of this session, but we will have a question and answer format now. And
please,
if you would kindly raise your hands, I'll assign you numbers 1, and then wait for the mic to come to you. Introduce yourself. Please stand up, and then ask a question and not a commentary, please. Number 2, sure. Anybody
Commentaries
else?
are fine with me. I'm here to learn.
Brevity. Yes, sir.
This is Ermal Hitay, graduate student at the University of Maryland, and thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question, maybe a couple, but I don't want to preempt other questions, so I'll limit myself. The first one is as regards this tension, and that's a major question. So for NATO now to reorient itself and to reinvent itself, what we need, and I can say we because my country just became a NATO member.
What's your country?
Albania.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. So what we need is not just a set of common values, but a common policy vision, and that is miserably lacking. So as regards Russia, the feelings of the Europeans are very different from the feelings of the United States. What the Germans feel is very different from what the Turks might feel about Russia. As regards involvement in the Middle East, the vision or the policy vision of different NATO countries is very different. So let's say the vision of Turkey for the Middle East, or their strategic policy vision, is much different from the strategic policy vision of France, which is much different from the strategic policy vision of the United States. Now, do you see NATO surviving as a functional entity despite all these tensions? I mean, it could survive. It could survive as a covered decorum for United States operations, but not as a functional entity. So where do you see all these different tensions pulling NATO in the near term? Thank you.
Thank you. That is the most important question about NATO's future. Let me start with what unites people within NATO. There is a common set of values. A little bit here, a little bit there, but a common set of values, commitment to democracy, human rights, the underpinning, which is important, number 1. Number 2, there is a common organization in which every country sees at least part of its defense in terms of what NATO does. Third, there is an integrated military command structure in which military people from all 28 countries operate in the same language according to the same traditions, same practices, and so you can sort of plug and play no matter where you are. This has never happened before in history. Fourth, there's a common agreement that an attack on one is attack on all. Now, some countries may not be feeling that they're threatened from abroad now. Maybe they will be in the future. But there's a common understanding that this insurance policy is there and is important. Now, there's some other things. I think you were quite right to talk about the difference of policy and even some strategic analysis. In terms of vision, I think there's more commonality than is often looked at. Common vision about Russia is to try to draw Russia productively into the outside world, in which you will contribute to the security of others rather than take away from it. Now, there are different things that may have to be done, and different countries might parse it differently. Some would say you have to be more confrontational. Maybe some would say we need to take Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, so Russia will have no doubts about that. Some say need to focus on energy security, cybersecurity. Some others would say don't push the Russians too hard, don't put bases here and there. You got to recognize that Russia is going through problems. These are important differences of view, but it's within the same basic framework. How do you deal with the problem of Russia as the largest single landmass, as the largest single country, at least looking towards the West in terms of people, even though it's depopulating, a country that impacts upon just about everything in the Northern Hemisphere that the United States cares about, and most of the Allies care about. So, similar vision, different ways perhaps of going about it. Can we reconcile the different views so they add up to a single policy? At the moment, I think we're doing a pretty good job in Russia, but who knows in the future. When you get to the Middle East, similar kind of vision, but much more difficult to come up with common policies. A vision of a two-state solution for Israel, a secure Israel, and an independent Palestine, which is able to fulfill the aspirations of the Palestinian people. All right? An Iraq that, with the departure of the Americans, does not descend into civil war, where Kurdistan does not separate from Iraq, in which, and I think there's common view on that, in which the PKK is not able to operate against Turkey, right? And Afghanistan, which is not a home for Al-Qaeda. Now, some people would say it's more or less important to keep the Taliban from turning to Afghanistan. A common vision of a Pakistan that is able to be a coherent state, developing its own future. Now, that's a common vision, but within that, it's not just what is the best way to go about it, but who does things. Arab-Israeli peacemaking is mostly to be done by the United States, in part because most Europeans have put it on a higher priority than is often true in this country. Not true of Obama. He's put it very high on his priorities. But very few Europeans have any standing in Israel because of the history of relations with Israel. With regard to the Turkish problem with the threat from the PKK, not many countries pay much attention to that. The United States does, and that's a pretty important partner to have on that. Incidentally, when the president went to Europe, there were four summits. Most important was in London with the economy. There were five, actually. The meeting with Medvedev, I'm going to take care of the Russian problem. Third, dealing with Iran, there was the donors conference in The Hague, and the American representative shook hands with the Iranian representative, and the United States is now going to try to reverse its policy of isolating Iran to see if that'll work. Then the NATO summit, and then going to Turkey. I cannot emphasize more the fact that the president went to Turkey and made the speech that he did in the Turkish parliament. The United States standing in Turkey dropped to about 9%, the worst ever. That is strategically, politically, morally, economically, et cetera, an awful thing to have happened, and that is, on whatever one of those five adjectives I've just used, you got to do something about it. And the president took a lot of courage on it to go forward. We've got to deal effectively with the Iranian question. Iran's going to be there. You don't destroy it. Preventing a war with Iran, but keeping it from getting the bomb if it wants to go in that direction, if that's what it is indeed doing, is a very important thing. Different views about how to go about it. Different views about what to do in Afghanistan and who should do it. And then you get to the question of Pakistan, which I don't know anybody who has yet a coherent view on it. So you're absolutely right. I think NATO has got to think in the future about not going, to use an old phrase, a bridge too far. I think it needs to focus far more on the territory within which it now finds itself, not try to become global, because quite frankly, most countries don't see it that way. Focus on those things that countries will see in common. Now, in order to preserve the U.S. engagement in NATO, a number of NATO countries are going to be asked to do more things in the Middle East and Southwest Asia than they may want to do in their own self-interest. But they've got to think, I want the United States with me tomorrow, I better help America today. Or maybe America is right, that if we don't do something effective in Afghanistan, we're going to have more terrorism, more trouble within Europe. So you asked exactly the right question, and there is no obvious answer to it except people thinking very carefully about the penalty we would all pay if we didn't have a NATO.
One quick comment, if I may, Mr. Ambassador. You mentioned that the Europeans have real problems being an honest broker within the Israeli-Palestinian concept.
They're not acceptable to the Israelis.
But I tell you, most Muslim countries regard the U.S. as not an honest broker either. Otherwise, where is the peace that was promised 60 years ago? Anyway,
the United States has a fundamental responsibility in our interest, in the interest of the Israelis, in the interest of the Palestinians, the interest of the Middle East, the interest of the Europeans, to play a vigorous, forthright role in peacemaking. No step towards peace, as we've seen over the last 30 years now, beginning with the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, has taken place without the engagement of the United States. The Oslo Accords were basically done by the Norwegians, but that's the one exception. No American president has a right to pull back from that. Some have tried. This president has started out right away and said, I'm going to be directly involved. I don't know whether he's going to succeed on it.
Time will tell.
But he knows he has a responsibility to all those parties I mentioned to play this particular kind of role. Okay. And I don't think we have that much more time left. It's very important to understand just how extraordinarily threatening the situation and circumstances are across the great swath of the Middle East into Southwest Asia, which are not just about state relations, they're also about generations growing up. It's about governance, about people having opportunity in their lives. It's about people being recruited by terrorist recruiters. There's a whole wide range that mean this has to be, let me talk about it this way, a human vocation of the first order.
Yeah. Excellent point. We had a question?
Yes. Hi, my name is Mahmoud Aydomush. I work at the World Bank.
I'm sorry, you are?
At the World Bank.
Oh, good. You're the guy with the money. Can I get a loan?
Go to the IMF these days.
Yes, thank you.
They are the ones that have the money these days. I wanted to touch base on your
It's on. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's on. On your future vision for the NATO, you talked about health, education, and good governance going forward. Do you see this as a vision for the NATO, or under which roof do you see this happening going forward? Should NATO being mostly recognized as a military kind of establishment, is it going to be able to move in that direction, or do you see this more as a role shared with the UN and other international organizations like the World Bank, IMF, etc.? My other question is, you mentioned that Turkey is sometimes creating tensions when dealing with UN, between UN and NATO. If you could
European Union and
European Union now. If you could expand on it. And also, it's going to be a third question. You partially mentioned PKK, and US is the only NATO member who recognizes PKK, if I understood you correctly, as a threat, as a terrorist organization attacking Turkey, and why others are not recognizing.
Thank you.
Oh, I think most allies recognize the PKK for what it is, but the United States is really the country that's in a position to do something about it. In terms of our assistance with Turkey, but in ways that you may know about, and also because of our predominant role in Iraq. And as we withdraw from Iraq, our very acute sensitivity that you don't see a move by the Kurds there to move towards independence, that you do see a capacity for Iraqi security personnel to keep the PKK from doing what it's been doing in Turkey. So we have the lead on that, but we're not the only ones. With regard to NATO's role, as you mentioned, I think we need to step back and say, okay, let's do a strategic review. The strategic review is there are an awful lot of things that need to be done in our self-interest, European self-interest, the self-interest of countries in, let's say, the Middle East and South Asia is a very important priority. Some of those things are going to be military. Most are going to be non-military. And when you get to the non-military, why ask NATO to do something for which it's ill-suited when there are all these other organizations? Mm-hmm. If you're going to deal with energy in Europe, you have the International Energy Agency. If you have, in terms of dealing with other problems, the problems I've mentioned, you've got the World Bank, you've got the IMF, you've got a host of NGOs, you've got the European Union, you've got the United Nations specialized agencies. What you need to do is find a way that they all work together, and not say who's going to be the leader and who isn't. Now, this has been learned on the ground in Iraq by the United States and its few coalition partners. It's been learned on the ground in Afghanistan by everybody there. You have to work with not just the local government, it's their country. You know, work with the UN, with the EU, with the World Bank, with a host of non-governmental organizations who do an awful lot of the human work which actually has a strategic purpose. Because if it leads people to live better lives and they're able to get on with their own lives and not be there when Al-Qaeda knocks on the door, that's a gain. So you let them get on with it. You give them what support they want. If they say, keep out of my way, we keep out of their way. But what you do is you figure out what's the requirement and then who does what. And in most cases I'm talking about, NATO is going to be the junior partner, and should be.
Thank you, Ambassador Hunter. I think we've come to the end of our program, and now I would ask Ali Yurtseva, President of the Rumi Forum, to present you a small gift on behalf of Rumi Forum.
Thank you very much.